The warm afternoon sun shone down on Cedar Street as Marcus Johnson walked home from basketball practice. The 14-year-old boy was tired but happy after scoring several baskets during the team's practice session. His blue and white school backpack bounced lightly against his shoulders, and the gentle spring breeze ruffled his basketball jersey, which was still damp with sweat. As Marcus approached the busy intersection at Cedar and Main Street, something caught his attention. An elderly woman stood at the corner, her hands gripping a metal walker tightly. She looked worried as she watched the cars zoom past, the driver seemingly unaware of her presence. The crossing signal kept changing from red to green and back again, but the woman hadn't moved from her spot. Marcus remembered what his mother always told him: if you see someone who needs help, don't wait for others to step up. His mother worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and she had taught him the importance of showing kindness to everyone, especially older people who might need assistance. Taking a deep breath, Marcus walked over to the woman. He noticed her white hair was neatly styled, and she wore a pretty floral dress with a light cardigan. Her walker had a small basket attached to the front, which held a brown leather purse and what looked like a shopping list. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said politely, making sure to stand where she could see him clearly. "Would you like some help crossing the street?" The woman turned to look at him, relief washing over her face. Her blue eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "Oh, thank goodness," she said. "I've been standing here for almost 10 minutes. These cars are moving so fast today, and my legs aren't as steady as they used to be. I'm Marcus," he introduced himself, remembering his father's lessons about always being respectful and introducing yourself to others. "I'd be happy to help you cross safely." "What a lovely young man you are, Marcus. I'm Mrs. Eleanor Hamilton, but you can call me Mrs. Eleanor." She adjusted her grip on the walker. "I need to get to Johnson's pharmacy. My arthritis medicine is ready for pickup." Marcus nodded, understanding why she needed to cross the street. Johnson's pharmacy was on the other side, about half a block down. He'd been there many times with his mom to pick up his little sister's asthma medication. "I'll stay right beside you, Mrs. Eleanor," Marcus assured her. "We'll wait for the next green light, and I'll make sure no cars try to turn while we're crossing." He positioned himself slightly behind her walker, ready to help guide her. The light turned red, and cars came to a stop. When the walking signal appeared, Marcus looked both ways, just as his parents had taught him. "Okay, Mrs. Eleanor, the path is clear. We can start crossing now." Mrs. Eleanor smiled gratefully and began pushing her walker forward. Marcus walked beside her, matching her careful pace. He noticed how she moved slowly but deliberately, each step calculated to maintain her balance. About halfway across the intersection, a car honked impatiently, making Mrs. Eleanor jump slightly. Marcus raised his hand politely toward the driver, signaling them to wait. He then turned to Mrs. Eleanor with an encouraging smile. "Don't worry about them, Mrs. Eleanor. We have plenty of time, and you're doing great." As they continued their careful journey across the street, Mrs. Eleanor chatted with Marcus. She told him about her 3 grandchildren who lived in different states and how she missed seeing them regularly. Marcus listened attentively, nodding and asking questions at the right moments. "My youngest granddaughter, Sarah, is about your age," Mrs. Eleanor shared. "She's coming to visit next month. It's so nice to meet a young person with such good manners, just like her." Marcus felt his chest warm with pride at her words. His parents always emphasized the importance of helping others and being respectful, and it felt good to know he was living up to their teachings. Just as they were about to reach the curb, Marcus noticed a white SUV stopped at the light. The woman behind the wheel was watching them intently, her face twisted in an expression Marcus couldn't quite understand. He didn't know it yet, but this woman's reaction to his simple act of kindness would soon turn this ordinary afternoon into something much more complicated. For now, though, Marcus focused on helping Mrs. Eleanor safely step up onto the sidewalk, making sure her walker was stable on the concrete. The first part of their journey together was complete. But little did Marcus know that this chance encounter would lead to events that would impact not only his life, but the entire community. Now safely on the sidewalk, Marcus and Mrs. Eleanor began their short walk to Johnson's pharmacy. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the concrete as they moved at a steady, unhurried pace. Marcus stayed close to Mrs. Eleanor's side, making sure she felt secure with each step. "My grandson used to help me like this," Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice warm with memory. Before he moved to California for college, he would come by every Sunday after church. She paused to adjust her grip on the walker. Now, I mostly manage on my own, but some days, like today, these old bones just don't want to cooperate. Marcus listened thoughtfully, remembering his own grandmother who lived in Georgia. My grandma lives far away too, he shared. We video chat with her every weekend, but it's not the same as being there in person. Mrs. Eleanor's face brightened at this connection. Oh, video calls are wonderful, aren't they? Though I must say, I still haven't quite figured out how to stop turning the camera upside down sometimes. She chuckled, and Marcus smiled, thinking of his own grandmother's similar struggles with technology. As they approached the pharmacy, Marcus noticed Mrs. Eleanor's breathing had become a bit heavier. Without making a fuss, he slowed their pace slightly. We're almost there, Mrs. Eleanor. Would you like to take a short break? No, dear, but thank you for asking. I can make it, she replied with determination. You know, when you get to my age, every trip becomes a little adventure. But having kind company makes it so much more pleasant. Behind them, Marcus heard the sound of a car moving slowly. He glanced back and saw the white SUV from the intersection. The woman driver was still watching them, now holding up her phone as if recording. Marcus felt uncomfortable but remembered what his father always said. The best response to unwanted attention is to carry yourself with dignity. At the pharmacy entrance, Marcus held the door open while carefully helping Mrs. Eleanor maneuver her walker over the small threshold. The cool air conditioning inside was a welcome relief from the warm afternoon. The familiar smell of medicine and paper products filled the air, and soft music played from speakers overhead. Mrs. Hamilton, the pharmacist, Mr. Rodriguez, called out from behind the counter. I was starting to worry about you. You usually come in the morning for your prescriptions. Mrs. Eleanor waved at the familiar face. Oh, I had a bit of trouble getting here today, but this wonderful young man, Marcus, helped me cross the street. She patted Marcus's arm affectionately. Such a gentleman, just like they don't make any more. Mr. Rodriguez smiled warmly at Marcus. That's very kind of you, young man. Mrs. Hamilton is one of our favorite customers. Marcus helped Mrs. Eleanor navigate through the aisles to the pharmacy counter. While she spoke with Mr. Rodriguez about her medication, Marcus noticed a small display of reading glasses. He remembered Mrs. Eleanor mentioning her trouble with video calls and wondered if better glasses might help. Here you are, Mrs. Hamilton, Mr. Rodriguez said, handing over a white paper bag. All your medications are ready, and I've included the printed instructions you requested. Mrs. Eleanor reached for her purse, but her hands trembled slightly as she tried to open the clasp. Without drawing attention to her struggle, Marcus pretended to be interested in a nearby magazine while staying close enough to help if needed. Just then, through the pharmacy's front windows, Marcus saw 2 police cars pull up outside, their lights flashing. His heart began to beat faster, though he wasn't sure why. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just helping someone who needed it, just as his parents had taught him. Mrs. Eleanor was still fumbling with her purse, unaware of what was happening outside. Marcus took a deep breath and decided to stay focused on helping her. He could see the white SUV parked across the street, the woman driver now standing beside it, pointing toward the pharmacy while talking to someone on her phone. Mrs. Eleanor, Marcus said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady despite his growing anxiety, would you like me to hold your walker steady while you look for your wallet? She looked up at him gratefully. Oh, would you? These old fingers aren't as nimble as they used to be. As Marcus held the walker, Mrs. Eleanor finally managed to open her purse, completely unaware of the situation developing outside the pharmacy's doors. Karen Matthews stood outside her white SUV, her manicured fingers gripping her phone tightly as she spoke to the 911 operator. Her face was flushed with what she believed was righteous concern, though it was nothing more than prejudice in disguise. Yes, I followed them to Johnson's Pharmacy on Main Street, she said into the phone, her voice sharp with fake worry. The elderly woman looks confused and frightened. He's probably trying to steal her purse or force her to withdraw money. Every word she spoke was a lie born from her own biased assumptions. Inside the pharmacy, Marcus was still unaware of Karen's false accusations. He held Mrs. Eleanor's walker steady while she counted out exact change for her prescription. The air conditioning hummed quietly, and the overhead speakers played soft music. It seemed like a normal afternoon, but that was about to change. The bell above the pharmacy door chimed as two police officers entered. Officer James Chen and Officer Sarah Martinez moved purposefully into the store, their hands resting near their weapons. The peaceful atmosphere immediately changed to one of tension. There he is. Karen had followed the officers inside, pointing dramatically at Marcus. That's the suspicious person I told you about. Mrs. Eleanor looked up from her purse, startled by the commotion. Her eyes widened as she saw the officers approaching. Marcus felt his heart racing, but he remembered his parents' teachings about staying calm when dealing with police. "Step away from the elderly lady," Officer Chen commanded, his voice firm but professional. Marcus began to move slowly, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. But before he could step back, Mrs. Eleanor did something unexpected. She gripped her walker firmly and positioned herself between Marcus and the officers. "What do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Eleanor's voice was sharp with anger. The slight tremor in her hands was gone, replaced by firm determination. "This young man is helping me. Nothing more." Mr. Rodriguez, the pharmacist, quickly came out from behind his counter. "Officers, there's been a mistake," he said firmly. "I've been watching them since they came in. Marcus was helping Mrs. Hamilton with her prescription pickup. She's a regular customer here." Karen Matthews stepped forward, her designer purse swinging on her arm. "But I saw him forcing her to cross the street. She looked scared." "Scared?" Mrs. Eleanor turned to face Karen, her blue eyes blazing. "The only thing that scared me today was the cars rushing past while I tried to cross the street. Until this kind young man, this gentleman, offered to help me. Other customers in the pharmacy had stopped to watch. An older man with a cane spoke up from near the vitamin aisle. I saw them crossing the street too. That boy was being nothing but respectful and careful." Officer Martinez had been observing the situation carefully. She noticed how Marcus remained calm and respectful, how Mrs. Eleanor protectively stood by him, and how the community members quickly came to his defense. This was clearly not what Karen Matthews had described in her 911 call. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez turned to Karen, her voice stern. "Did you actually see this young man do anything threatening?" Karen's confident expression began to falter. "Well, he was walking very close to her. Because I needed his support." Mrs. Eleanor interrupted. "Do you think I can walk easily at my age? This boy, Marcus, showed more kindness in 5 minutes than you have in this entire situation." The pharmacy had grown quiet except for Mrs. Eleanor's voice. Even the overhead music seemed to have paused, as if listening to her words. Marcus stood still, touched by how this woman he just met was defending him so fiercely. Officer Chen turned to his partner, and they exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen this kind of situation before. Someone calling the police because they saw a person of color doing something completely innocent. "Mrs. Matthews," Officer Martinez said, using the name Karen had given during her 911 call, "making false police reports is a serious offense. You could face charges for misusing emergency services." Karen's face turned red, but this time with embarrassment rather than false outrage. She clutched her purse tighter and looked around, suddenly aware that everyone in the pharmacy was staring at her with disapproval. The tension in Johnson's pharmacy continued to build as more customers gathered around the scene. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air conditioning seemed to blow colder than before. Marcus stood quietly, his hands still visible, while Mrs. Eleanor remained firmly positioned between him and the officers. "I want to press charges," Mrs. Eleanor announced suddenly, her voice clear and strong. Everyone turned to look at her in surprise. "Not against Marcus," she clarified, pointing a slightly shaky finger at Karen Matthews. "Against this woman who tried to ruin this young man's life with her prejudiced assumptions." Officer Martinez pulled out her notepad, her face serious. "Mrs. Hamilton, you have every right to file a complaint. Would you like to make a formal statement?" Karen's face went pale. She hadn't expected this turn of events. But I was trying to help," she stammered, her voice rising with panic. "I was being a good citizen." "A good citizen?" Mr. Rodriguez spoke up from behind his counter. He had been recording the entire incident on his phone. "A good citizen doesn't profile innocent people. A good citizen doesn't make false police reports. Would you have called 911 if Marcus had been white? The pharmacy fell silent at this direct question. Even the usual beeping of the prescription scanner seemed muted. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Just then, the pharmacy door chimed again. Marcus's mother, Lisa Johnson, rushed in wearing her nurse's scrubs. One of the pharmacy customers had recognized Marcus and called the hospital where his mother worked. Marcus, Lisa called out, her voice tight with worry. She quickly took in the scene. The police officers, her son standing calmly, the elderly woman protecting him, and the flustered woman in expensive clothes who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Mom, Marcus said softly, relief evident in his voice. I'm okay. I was just helping Mrs. Eleanor cross the street and get her medicine. Lisa walked over to her son, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. She looked at the officers, her voice steady despite her concern. My son was raised to help people in need. That's all he was doing today. Officer Chen nodded, his expression softening. We can see that now, Mrs. Johnson. Your son conducted himself very well during this incident. He turned to Karen Matthews, his voice becoming more formal. Ma'am, we need to discuss the consequences of making false police reports. Karen's confident demeanor had completely crumbled. She looked around the pharmacy, seeing nothing but disapproving faces. I didn't mean. She began, but Mrs. Eleanor cut her off. Oh, you meant exactly what you did, Mrs. Eleanor said firmly. You saw a young black boy helping an old white woman and jumped to the worst possible conclusion. You didn't see his kindness, his patience, or his good manners. You only saw what your prejudice wanted you to see. Several customers nodded in agreement. A young woman who had been recording the incident on her phone spoke up. I'm posting this online. People need to see what happens when someone calls the police on black people for just living their lives. Marcus's mother squeezed his shoulder gently. I'm proud of you, son, she whispered. But I'm so sorry you had to experience this. Officer Martinez finished writing in her notepad and addressed Karen. Mrs. Matthews, please step outside with Officer Chen. We need to take your statement, and we'll be discussing potential charges for misuse of emergency services. As Karen was led outside, looking thoroughly chastened, Mrs. Eleanor turned to Marcus and his mother. Her earlier anger had softened into concern. Marcus, I am so sorry this happened to you. You showed nothing but kindness, and this is how you were repaid. It's not your fault, Mrs. Eleanor, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. I'm just glad I could help you. Mr. Rodriguez emerged from behind his counter with a bottle of water for Mrs. Eleanor and another for Marcus. The world needs more people like you, young man, he said, handing them the bottles. And fewer people who judge others based on the color of their skin. The other customers in the pharmacy began to disperse, some stopping to pat Marcus on the shoulder or share kind words. The incident was over, but its impact would continue to ripple through the community in ways none of them could yet imagine. Outside Johnson's pharmacy, a small crowd had gathered. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk as people stopped to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Eleanor, despite her age and physical limitations, stood tall as she gave her official statement to Officer Martinez. I want every word of this recorded properly, Mrs. Eleanor insisted, her voice clear and determined. She sat in a chair Mr. Rodriguez had brought out for her, but her posture remained dignified and strong. That woman didn't just call the police on an innocent boy. She called them on the very idea of human kindness. Lisa Johnson stood nearby, her arm protectively around Marcus's shoulders. Her hospital ID badge caught the sunlight as she listened to Mrs. Eleanor's passionate defense of her son. Other nurses from the nearby medical center, still in their scrubs, had come during their break after hearing what happened to their colleague's son. Marcus didn't just help me cross the street, Mrs. Eleanor continued, looking directly at Officer Martinez's notepad. He showed patience when I walked slowly. He asked about my grandchildren. He held my walker steady while I got my medicine. Her voice cracked slightly with emotion. In my 82 years, I've seen too many good people hurt by prejudice, and I won't stand for it anymore. A young woman from the bakery next door came out with cups of water for everyone. She had been one of the witnesses who recorded the incident on her phone. The video is already getting attention online, she told Marcus's mother quietly. People are sharing it and demanding justice. Mr. Rodriguez emerged from his pharmacy with a folder in his hand. "Officers, I have the security camera footage from both inside and outside the store," he said. "It clearly shows everything that happened. And I've saved all our camera footage from previous times Mrs. Hamilton has visited our pharmacy. She's been coming here for years, always alone, showing she's perfectly capable of making her own decisions." Officer Martinez nodded, accepting the folder. "This will be very helpful for the investigation, sir." Meanwhile, Officer Chen was still talking to Karen Matthews by the police car. Her previous arrogance had disappeared completely, replaced by nervous fidgeting as she realized the seriousness of her actions. Several of her neighbors had recognized her in the growing crowd, their disapproving looks making her shrink further into herself. A distinguished-looking man in a suit approached the officers. "I'm James Wilson, from the City Council," he introduced himself. "I was having lunch across the street when this happened. This kind of racial profiling is exactly what our new community outreach program aims to prevent." Mrs. Eleanor perked up at this. "Then let this be your first case study, Mr. Wilson. Show people what happens when they let their prejudices override their humanity." She turned to look at Marcus. "Show them what they miss when they only see color instead of character." Lisa Johnson stepped forward, her voice steady but emotional. "My husband and I taught Marcus to help others, to be kind, to respect his elders. We also had to teach him how to behave if the police ever stopped him, how to keep his hands visible, how to stay calm even when he's done nothing wrong. No parent should have to teach their child these things, and we do because of people like Mrs. Matthews." The crowd murmured in agreement. Among them were several of Marcus's teachers who had rushed over after school when they heard what happened to their student. His basketball coach stood at the back, his arms crossed, shaking his head at the injustice of it all. A reporter from the local newspaper had arrived and was taking notes. She approached Marcus respectfully, asking if he felt comfortable sharing his side of the story. Before Marcus could answer, Mrs. Eleanor spoke up again. "Young lady," she addressed the reporter, "make sure you write this exactly right. This story isn't just about what happened today. It's about every time someone sees a person of color and assumes the worst. It's about every time kindness is mistaken for crime because of the color of someone's skin. And most importantly, it's about a brave young man who, despite knowing these risks, still chose to help an old woman in need." The reporter nodded solemnly, writing every word. The story was growing beyond a simple incident at a pharmacy. It was becoming a moment of change for their community, all because of one boy's simple act of kindness and one elderly woman's refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice. As the afternoon turned to early evening, the crowd outside Johnson's pharmacy began to transform into something more organized. Someone had brought chairs for Mrs. Eleanor and Lisa Johnson, while others from nearby businesses offered bottles of water and snacks. The community's response to the incident was shifting from shock to action. Officer Martinez finished taking statements from all the witnesses and approached Karen Matthews for the final time. "Mrs. Matthews," she said firmly, "based on the evidence and witness statements, we're citing you for misuse of emergency services. You'll need to appear in court next month." She handed Karen a yellow citation slip. "Additionally, the City Council may require you to attend community sensitivity training." Karen's face flushed red as she accepted the citation with trembling hands. Her designer purse hung limply at her side, and her earlier self-righteousness had completely disappeared. Several of her neighbors who had gathered at the scene deliberately turned their backs on her, making their disapproval clear. I didn't mean for all this to happen," Karen stammered, looking around at the crowd. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward, still wearing his white pharmacist coat. "The right thing would have been to mind your own business, or better yet, to offer help if you really thought someone needed it, but you didn't do that, did you?" Marcus, who had been quietly sitting with his mother, watched as Karen's shoulders slumped in defeat. Despite everything she had put him through, he felt a strange mix of emotions. His father had always taught him that sometimes people could learn and change, but only if they truly faced their mistakes. Mrs. Eleanor, still sitting regally in her chair, spoke up. "Young man," she called to Marcus, "would you help me stand? I think it's time we had a word with Mrs. Matthews." Marcus immediately went to Mrs. Eleanor's side, gently helping her to her feet. The crowd parted as they approached Karen, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. "Mrs. Matthews," Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I want you to look at this young man, really look at him." She placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder. "What do you see now?" Karen lifted her eyes slowly, really looking at Marcus for the first time. She saw a teenager in a basketball jersey, with kind eyes and a gentle way of supporting Mrs. Eleanor. She saw the same boy who had carefully helped an elderly woman cross the street, the same boy she had immediately assumed was a threat. I see a young man helping someone," Karen said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I see what I should have seen the first time." "That's right," Mrs. Eleanor nodded. "And maybe next time, you'll remember this moment before you make assumptions about someone based on their appearance." Officer Chen, who had been watching the exchange, stepped forward. "Mrs. Matthews, your court date is next month. I suggest you use this time to reflect on your actions and their consequences." The local news crew had arrived by this point, and their camera captured the powerful moment. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, approached Marcus and Mrs. Eleanor respectfully. "Would you be willing to share your story?" she asked. "I think it's important for people to hear about both the problem and the solution, how prejudice can hurt people, but also how communities can stand up against it." Before Marcus could respond, his father arrived, still wearing his business suit from work. Michael Johnson rushed to embrace his son, having left an important meeting as soon as he heard what happened. "Son, are you okay?" he asked, checking Marcus over as any worried parent would. "I'm fine, Dad," Marcus assured him. "Mrs. Eleanor and everyone here stood up for me. They made sure the truth was heard." Michael Johnson turned to Mrs. Eleanor, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you for protecting my boy," he said, his voice full of emotion. Mrs. Eleanor smiled warmly. "Your son protected me first, Mr. Johnson. He showed me kindness when I needed it, and I simply returned the favor. That's how community should work." The evening news would later show footage of this moment. An elderly white woman standing proudly beside a young black teenager and his family, surrounded by a community that had chosen to stand up against prejudice and defend kindness. The next morning, Marcus's story was everywhere. The local news channels played the pharmacy's security footage and the witnesses' cell phone videos on repeat. The headline, "Kind Boy's Good Deed Met with Racism," appeared on the front page of the city newspaper, accompanied by a powerful photo of Mrs. Eleanor standing protectively beside Marcus. At Cedar Grove High School, Marcus tried to have a normal day, but that proved impossible. As he walked through the hallways, other students stopped to show their support. Many had already seen the videos on social media, where the story had gone viral overnight. "Did you see how many shares the video got?" Marcus's best friend Tommy asked during lunch break. "People all over the country are talking about what happened. You're like a hero, man." Marcus shook his head modestly. "I'm not a hero, Tommy. I just did what anyone should do. Help someone who needed it." The school principal, Dr. Sarah Martinez, called a special assembly that morning. The gymnasium filled with students and teachers, all buzzing with discussion about the incident. Marcus sat in the front row with his parents, feeling somewhat uncomfortable with all the attention. "Yesterday, one of our students showed us what it means to be a true member of this community," Dr. Martinez began, her voice carrying across the quiet gym. Marcus Johnson didn't help Mrs. Eleanor for attention or praise. He helped her because it was the right thing to do. But what happened next shows us that we still have work to do in our society. She gestured to a group of people seated on the stage. Mrs. Eleanor, City Council member James Wilson, and several community leaders. Mrs. Eleanor, dressed in a lovely purple dress and supported by her walker, moved to the microphone. "When I was young," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I saw too many people stay quiet when they should have spoken up. Yesterday, I promised myself I wouldn't make that same mistake. But what amazed me was how the whole community joined in to support this wonderful young man." As she spoke, the large screen behind her showed clips from yesterday's events. Students watched intently as the scene unfolded, their classmate helping an elderly woman, the false accusations, and the community's powerful response. City Council member Wilson stepped up next. "In response to yesterday's events, we're launching a new program called Bridges of Kindness. This program will connect local youth with elderly residents who need assistance with daily tasks. Marcus and Mrs. Eleanor have agreed to be our first team of advisors. The gymnasium erupted in applause. Marcus felt his face grow warm as his classmates turned to look at him with admiration. His mother squeezed his hand proudly. During the assembly, several local business owners stood up to speak. Mr. Rodriguez from the pharmacy announced he would start a scholarship fund for students who demonstrated exceptional community service. The owner of the local diner declared that her restaurant would become a safe space where anyone who felt threatened could come for help. Local religious leaders from different faiths spoke about unity and standing up against prejudice. Rabbi Cohen, Pastor Williams, and Imam Hassan stood together, showing their united support for positive change in the community. After the assembly, a group of senior citizens who had heard about the incident approached Marcus. They were friends of Mrs. Eleanor from her church group. "We've been afraid to go out sometimes," one elderly gentleman admitted. "But seeing how you helped Eleanor and how the community protected you both, it gives us hope." A local TV reporter interviewed some of Marcus's teachers. His basketball coach spoke about Marcus's character, describing how he always helped younger players learn the game. His English teacher talked about an essay Marcus had written about his grandmother, showing his deep respect for older people. By the end of the school day, what had started as a terrible incident had transformed into something powerful. Students were signing up for the new Bridges of Kindness program, eager to make a difference in their community. Social media continued to spread the story, with people sharing their own experiences and pledging to stand up against prejudice. As Marcus packed up his backpack to head home, he found a handwritten note in his locker. It was from Mrs. Eleanor, written in elegant cursive. "Dear Marcus, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes. Thank you for being the spark that lit up our community's conscience. Would you and your family join me for Sunday dinner this weekend? Your friend, Mrs. Eleanor." 1 month later, the Johnson family's car pulled up to Mrs. Eleanor's charming blue house on Maple Street. It was their fourth Sunday dinner together, a tradition that had started after the incident at the pharmacy. Marcus stepped out of the car carrying a homemade apple pie his mother had baked, while his little sister Sarah held a bouquet of fresh flowers. The front porch of Mrs. Eleanor's house looked different now. A new ramp had been installed beside the steps, part of a community project where local contractors volunteered their time to help elderly residents. The idea had come from the Bridges of Kindness program, which had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. "Welcome, welcome." Mrs. Eleanor called from the doorway, her walker now decorated with colorful stickers made by local schoolchildren. The house smelled of pot roast and fresh bread, and family photos lined the walls, including a new one of Mrs. Eleanor with the Johnson family. "The court hearing was this morning," Mrs. Eleanor said as they settled in the living room. She had attended Karen Matthews' hearing for misuse of emergency services. "I think something good might come of it after all." She explained how Karen had stood before the judge, very different from the angry woman who had called the police that day. Karen had completed her mandatory sensitivity training and had gone beyond what was required. She'd been volunteering at a local community center, working with diverse groups of people and learning from her mistakes. She asked to speak to Marcus, Mrs. Eleanor added carefully, looking at Marcus's parents. She wants to apologize in person, but only if Marcus feels comfortable with it. Marcus thought about it while helping Mrs. Eleanor set the dinner table, something he now did every Sunday. The plates clinked softly as he placed them on the lace tablecloth, remembering how this all started with a simple decision to help someone cross the street. "I think I'd be willing to hear what she has to say," Marcus said finally. His parents exchanged proud looks. Their son's capacity for forgiveness never ceased to amaze them. The doorbell rang, and Sarah ran to answer it. It was Tommy, Marcus's best friend, along with several other teens from the Bridges of Kindness program. They'd often joined these Sunday dinners now, part of the extended family that had formed around Mrs. Eleanor's dining table. "Wait till you hear the news," Tommy exclaimed excitedly. "The video of what happened hit 2 million views today. A national news channel wants to do a story about how our community responded. They're calling it the Kindness Revolution." Mrs. Eleanor smiled as she watched the young people chat. Her house, once quiet and lonely, was now filled with laughter and life. The Bridges of Kindness program had matched her with 2 other students besides Marcus, who helped her with groceries and yard work during the week. After dinner, as everyone gathered in the living room for dessert, Mrs. Eleanor showed them something special, a leather-bound album. Inside were newspaper clippings about the incident, photos of the community coming together, and letters from people all over the country who had been touched by the story. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a letter from a small town in Oregon. "They've started their own Bridges of Kindness program. And here's another from Florida and one from Texas. It's spreading like ripples in a pond." Marcus read some of the letters, amazed at how his simple act of kindness had touched so many lives. One letter was from a young black boy who wrote about feeling more confident helping others, knowing that communities could stand together against prejudice. The evening sun cast warm light through the windows as Mrs. Eleanor raised her glass of lemonade. "I'd like to make a toast," she said, her blue eyes twinkling. "To kindness, which knows no color. To community, which grows stronger when tested. And to my dear young friend Marcus, who reminded us all that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply help someone in need." As everyone clinked their glasses together, Marcus looked around the room filled with people who had become like family. The incident that could have left him bitter had instead opened his heart wider, showing him that for every person who judged unfairly, there were many more who would stand up for what was right. Outside, the sun was setting on another Sunday in their changed community. Tomorrow, more seniors would be matched with student volunteers, more ramps would be built, and more bridges of understanding would be formed. All because a kind black boy helped an old lady cross the street, and their community chose to stand up for what was right.